Hello, my name is Stephen Reese. I'm a professor of English at YSU with a concentration in the writing of poetry and the study of the writing of poetry, which we call poetics. So it will seem natural to you, I suppose, that the book to which I gravitated among the English Festival offerings this year was The Poet X by Elizabeth Acevedo. It interested me. I'd like to say a few things about that book that I hope will interest you. It interested me to listen to her read her poems, um, to hear how they sounded in her voice, and also to listen to her in interviews where she said more than once that in writing this book, she was trying to do two things at the same time. One being engage the reader with the particular experience of this person, Xiomara, and her development and her conflicts and her situation and where she lived and her family and so forth, but also to make those particularities universal, which I think most artists, literary artists, strive to do. And I think she did it well in this book. And I wanted to focus on one area in which I thought she did that especially well, and it concerns the sources of poetry, where poetry comes from. Um, in Xiomara's case, there are very particular things, but each of those particular things, if you look into the history of so many writers of poems, not only in this country, but around the world, those particular things turn out to be more or less universal things. And I just wanted to highlight a few of those, um, because I think it's something that the book does very, very effectively. So where do the poems come from? Right? They don't simply come out of nowhere. These sources can sometimes be negative things. They can sometimes emerge out of the sense that one's own voice either can't be found or has no place. And I think Xiomara definitely has that experience. Um, I'm thinking, for instance, of the poem on 52 called After, where things get said to her that by boys, by grown men, that shouldn't be said to her, and she has no response to it. Um, it makes her hands shake, she says. It makes my throat tight. So rather than singing something, saying something from that throat, you shut down. And she only calms down when she gets home and puts her headphones on and listens to Drake. But also when she gets her notebook out to grab my notebook and write and write and write all the things I wish I could have said. Make poems from the sharp feelings inside that feel like they could carve me wide open. So writing emerges out of the sense that something wasn't said or couldn't be said. Um, that element too feeds into her reaction to religion. I'm thinking of the poem that follows shortly after, called During Communion, on 56. Right? And this is about her mother's pressuring her to go to communion. Mira muchacha, go take God. Right? She has a way of guilting me compliant. Usually it works. But today I feel the question sticking to the roof of my mouth like a wafer. What's the point of God giving me life if I can't live it as my own? Why does listening to his commandments mean I need to shut down my own voice? Um, so, of course, this book, the progress of this book is ultimately about opening up that voice, discovering that voice. Um, but it needs a lot of assistance. It needs a lot, it has to come from a lot of places. not only her desire to do it. So these sources are mostly negative ones, and universal. The more you read about poets, the more you'll read about their being in some way unable to say what it is they wanted to say. This is especially true for writers in countries where um, there is the explicit pressure from, say, the government to say only certain things. There's a picture, whoops, wrong way, picture right behind me of the Cuban poet Jose Marti, uh, great poet, great journalist, but a writer who lived in Cuba in the 19th century when the Spanish still ran Cuba. And if he were to have said what he wanted to say with his voice, it would have gotten him in most likely fatal trouble. So Marti had to leave in order to find that voice, in order to be able to say what he had to say. See, Mara's condition is not quite that extreme, but you'll find some version or other of that difficulty in many, many writers, especially poets. Well, the sources of poetry and of her poetry are not always negative ones. I think that the character of Ms. Galliano uh, is an excellent uh, example of a source that's encouraging. Ms. Galliano is a teacher who brings her into the poetry world, the public poetry world, and to have a teacher who encourages, to have a teacher that recognizes a talent or tries to encourage a talent, extraordinarily important. And again, as you look through the careers of any number of poets, you're bound to find that same experience. Ms. Galliano runs the poetry club. Uh, and I'm looking at the poem called Questions for Ms. Galliano on 75, where we discover that it's not always someone else who is keeping Xiomara's voice silent. Sometimes she does it herself. I'm one of the first students in English class the next day, and although I promised myself I would keep my lips stapled together, when Ms. Galliano asks me how I'm doing, the words trip and twist their ankles trying to rush out of my mouth. So you run the poetry club, right? That's all printed as a single word. So you run the poetry club, right? And thus begins Ms. Galliano's involvement in what is plainly Xiomara's curiosity um, and inner drive to become a part of this world, the poetry world. So teachers absolutely instrumental in the development of that poetic voice. You need that encouragement. One of my professors back at the University of Delaware, I'd found a first edition of one of his, of his first book, and he gave it back to me signed saying, for Steve with high hopes for his poems. And I treasured that. I mean, it was an inspiration to me. I still, of course, have it. And yeah, teacher figures matter a lot. So do models for this kind of behavior, especially for poets. It isn't always the case that the streets are crowded with poets that you can turn to for examples of how to actually do this or live this way. That's why it's important, I think, that moment where Ms. Galliano brings to class, this is the poem called Announcements on 182, brings to class someone who to say a poem. At the end of class, Ms. Galliano brings in a student from her poetry club. He's a Puerto Rican kid I've seen around with glasses and a kind smile. He says his name is Chris, and he invites us to join the club. Then he does a short poem. using his hands and his volume to grab our attention. Ms. Galliano looks on like a proud mama bear. And the class gives him half-hearted claps and a dap or two. He hands out flyers for the slam that's coming up. So it's hard to overestimate the importance of the actual immediate perception of a human being doing this activity that you dream of doing. Any poet will tell you that the experience of having a poet come to class, even someone who is not so well known, but a major poet entering the room, treating you like a fellow struggler in the craft, these are enormously important experiences for young writers. So Ms. Galliano is to be credited for that. What are other sources of poetry in this book that seem to me universal? The sense of freedom that comes with finding that voice and being able to share it, finding a listener, that is hard to find a parallel for. And when you read in poets' biographies about the moments, usually in youth, when they feel for the first time that very concrete sense of release and relief and freedom that comes with saying what you had to say in verse, you would recognize that as an element of Xiomara's experience that's universal. I'm looking at 246, rough draft of assignment 4. When was the last time you felt free? Maybe the last time I was happy saying a poem, with Aman listening to me, eyes half closed. That moment right before I opened my mouth, when I was nervous and my heart thumped fast, but I knew I could do it anyway, that I could say something, anything, in this moment, and someone was going to listen. Yeah, that's huge. And of course, ultimately, the listener that she needs the most is her mother. And that happens ultimately at the climactic moment of the book when she reads before the slam to her family. And the reaction is exactly the one that she needs. So support, very crucial in Xiomara's experience, but utterly universal when it comes to the writing of poems. The lack of that support has, and I can point you to circumstances, has crushed that aspiration. So when she finally gets it, it's a huge moment. She reads, when I'm done, Twin is smiling. Twin, of course, is almost always there as a support figure, but she needs more. And that includes her parents. When I'm done, Pappy claps. When I'm done, Mommy cocks her head and says, use your hand gestures a little less. And next time, en voz alta. Speak up, Xiomara. En voz alta. Right? So instead of shutting her down, make your voice more prominent, louder. Speak up. So support ultimately is central. I'm thinking of the great American poet Hart Crane, who's from just up the road in Garrettsville, and one of our great poets, but who paid dearly for that gift because of the obstacles he faced from family. It's helped destroy him. So very particular things about Xiomara's experience. you will find characteristic of the development of poets, especially, not only in this country, but everywhere you look. I wanted to close with two last remarks about things that might have been missed in the book, because Xiomara or Elizabeth Acevedo doesn't make them explicit. And that is, again, the importance of example. We talked about the student Chris coming in as an example, but there's also the larger, in some sense, example of all the writing that has been done before you. That's part of the tradition of, say, American poetry. You look to that as a resource. That itself is a source of poetry. And Xiomara makes reference to it twice without acknowledging it, but assuming, I think, that readers will know. I'll give you an example, 263. The title of this little haiku-looking thing is called "Hope is a Thing with Wings." Well, you can't title a poem that without readers of American poetry understanding that you're referencing Emily Dickinson. Hope is the Thing with Feathers, famous poem. So Xiomara is acknowledging in that little poem, without ever mentioning Emily Dickinson's name, that her experience, Dickinson's, informs Xiomara's experience. Why would it? Well, Emily Dickinson worked very, very hard in isolation, virtual isolation, to express herself, and rarely did it in any kind of public way. She was published very, very little during her own lifetime, and didn't have anyone to turn to when she talked about poetry. She finally reached out in a letter to a magazine editor, famous critic of the day, who came back and said, well, your poems are pretty rough, the meters are not regular, and you're kind of, the imagery is weird. In other words, all of the things we love Emily Dickinson for, this critic said was kind of a problem in her work. So Dickinson's difficulties in achieving her own voice, perhaps Xiomara is referencing her because she shares her dilemma. And there's a second case where this happens on 331. If you are a student of American poetry, you cannot approach this poem and see the title, which is called Facing It, and not immediately recognize that this is the title of one of the most famous poems of the 20th century by the African-American poet Yusef Komunyakaa. It's an extremely famous poem. Anybody writing knows it. And so, again, she's alluding to this tradition of writers that's enabling her to write. So one of the sources, but I think more hidden sources, of the poetry that Xiomara is able to create for herself is the long tradition of those writers who have come before her. And again, any poet will say that those traditions, not only the traditions of your native country, but poetry writing around the world and through all time, informs and encourages what they do. So I thought that was an especially interesting and more hidden element of the universal kind of source out of which Xiomara's particular poetry emerges. Well, I hope some of these things have been interesting for you and will return you to that text with renewed curiosity. I found it a fascinating read. I hope you're enjoying your festival experience, and that wherever you are looking at this, it's a beautiful, beautiful day out the windows, and that the rest of your day is most excellent. Thanks for listening. Take care.